The Jets make a major move that shocks the NFL, so it's a regular Tuesday around here. Joe Douglas is out as general manager. Firing Douglas was the easy part. Now comes the hard part, finding a credible replacement who actually wants to work for this franchise. Let's discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, and this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel because new customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. This is a bonus episode on this Tuesday. The bonus episode on Tuesday has become a tradition because the Jets have made a lot of big moves on Tuesday this season. Robert Saleh was fired on a Tuesday. The Davante Adams trade happened on a Tuesday. And now the Jets have fired general manager Joe Douglas on this Tuesday leading into their bye week. On this episode, we'll talk about Joe Douglas's biggest mistake during his 5.5-year tenure with the Jets. We'll talk about a move that needs to happen this offseason that's now even more urgent because the team is trading general managers. But let's begin by talking about just the firing of Joe Douglas and some general thoughts on it. Number one, this is a move that's controversial in the fan base because there is a wide segment of this Jets fan base that really liked the job Joe Douglas did. Well, I just have to say, I think it's completely justified. Look, I'm not saying everything Joe Douglas did was wrong. There were certain things he did which were excellent. The 2022 draft class is something that comes to mind. The drafting of Michael Carter, the second in 2021, an excellent slot corner, the signing of DJ Reed. Douglas is not the worst general manager to ever hold the office for the New York Jets. But at the end of the day, his record was 30-64 as Jets general manager. He did not have a winning season. And while there were some moves that were good, there simply were not enough good moves. And if Joe Douglas was a good GM, he would have had at least one winning season with this team. He would have built at least one roster that was talented enough to win 9 games. Would have built a roster that was talented enough to make the playoffs once in 6 years. It simply did not happen. So anybody saying that this firing is unjustified, I can't agree with that. Another question that's popping up in the fan base, why now? I'd ask why not now? I think if anything, the timing makes sense. Of all the big moves the Jets have made in season this year, the firing of Saleh, the trade for Davante Adams, the signing of Hassan Reddick after the holdout, this is the one that makes the most sense to me because it's not really going to impact the team that greatly, the timing of this. If you think about this, when the Jets fired Robert Saleh in week 5, that was the sort of thing that had a tangible impact on the way the rest of the season went because you had this big shakeup in the coaching staff. You lost Saleh, who's an excellent defensive coach. The defense has never recovered. You put in Jeff Ulbrich into a situation where he's completely in over his head. That damaged the team. Getting rid of Douglas now is not going to have an impact on the team. First of all, I don't think the way the team plays changes based on who the general manager is. Second of all, the season's lost anyway. And third of all, this gives you a little jump start on the general manager search. If anything, it gives you a head start on all the other teams searching for new general managers. You can start bringing in candidates. You can start interviewing people. You can start planning how you want to move forward. So I don't have any problem with any of this. Look, I think we all knew Douglas was on the way out anyway. There was really no way he was coming back. He was in the final year of his contract. He seemed kind of checked out. It didn't seem like he was that interested in returning. The Jets, certainly based on the lack of success with Douglas as the general manager, did not seem like they were interested in bringing him back. So all this was going to happen. Does it really make a difference whether it happens now or whether it happened after week 18? I would say no. Here's the challenge for the Jets. And this was going to be the challenge no matter when this happened. Whether you fired Douglas along with Saleh after week 5, whether you did it today or whether you did it after week 18. How are you going to get a good general manager to take this job right now? Because this ownership group has been nothing but erratic over the last 2 years. And part of the issue with this team is that the owner has not let the football people do their jobs. And that's just a fact. I mean, we know Woody Johnson was the driving force behind the trade for Aaron Rodgers. And in addition to being the driving force behind the trade for Aaron Rodgers, Woody Johnson was the driving force behind Robert Saleh getting fired. Does not sound like he consulted his general manager when he decided to change the coach 5 games into the season. We know Woody Johnson was the driving force behind the Davante Adams trade. And a reaction to the trade for Rodgers with the Jets. The Jets brought in all of Rodgers' friends with disastrous consequences. The Alan Lazard signing, the decision to hire Nathaniel Hackett. Last year, the signing of Randall Cobb. If you're a general manager candidate, and general managers usually only get one shot. It's not like coaches. A coach can be fired and get a second shot as a head coach later down the line. Most general managers don't get a second chance if they fail. Why would you put your career in Woody Johnson's hands right now? And I think that there are a lot of issues. Part of it is, look, I don't like the job Joe Douglas did as general manager, just like I don't like the job Robert Saleh did as head coach. But these are respected people. And now after 25 years of ownership, there are enough people who have worked for the Jets who have, made their way around the league. And what do you think they're telling everybody? Todd Bowles is another example. Todd Bowles did not do a great job as Jets head coach, but a respected guy around the league. These guys have left the Jets. Do you think that they're telling people who, are considering working for this team good things about working for Woody Johnson? Do you think they have anything good to say about this ownership? Or do you think they're saying you're putting your career in jeopardy because this ownership group is very erratic? This ownership group will get in the way of what you're trying to do. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to land a good candidate to replace Joe Douglas. And I think that the firing of Joe Douglas is fine. I think it was justified. I don't think Joe Douglas did a good enough job. But I think it's also true that ownership has contributed to the demise of this team through a series of completely illogical decisions. If you were a candidate for general manager, would you want to go to a place where the owner fires your handpicked head coach 5 games into the season? Would you want to go to a place where the owner decides and dictates you're trading for this quarterback and you're bringing in everybody this quarterback wants? I think it's going to be a very challenging set of circumstances. And beyond that, I mean, it's not like Woody Johnson had a great track record before this. Woody Johnson was the guy who forced the Tebow trade. Woody Johnson was the guy who forced the trade for Brett Favre. Woody Johnson's the guy who put his brother in charge when he went to England back in 2017. And Woody Johnson's brother is the guy who fired a GM after the draft. These guys don't know what they're doing. And these guys don't know when to intervene. They take a very heavy-handed approach at very, very inopportune times. So even if they promise you that they're going to step back, they've shown that they have no restraint. You can't believe them because they've told other people they'd step back. And what's happened? They've meddled in the Jets' affairs. It's going to be a real challenge right now. And I really don't know how you sell this job to a potential general manager candidate because this is just an ownership group that can't be trusted. And further adding to the complexity of this is all these rumors that Woody Johnson's going to take another job in the incoming administration. So you're going to go through this interview process. This owner's going to hire you, and then he's going to be gone, and you'll report to somebody who didn't hire you. Who's going to take the job under these circumstances? This is my concern. And this doesn't even touch on whether the owner can hire a competent candidate, which I have my doubts on because look at the other searches Woody Johnson's run through the years. He had to bring in a headhunting firm during the search where they hired John Idzik. He had to bring in Charlie Casserly and Ron Wolf during the search where they hired Mike McCagnon. Both of those were disaster hires. So it's clear that Woody Johnson has no idea what he's even looking for in a good general manager candidate. So even if the Jets could find somebody good who would be willing to work for him, it's not clear Woody would know how to find him because everything this ownership group has touched has turned into disaster. So the firing of Joe Douglas, I think, is justified. In fact, I'd say it was necessary. I would be upset if Joe Douglas was given yet another chance to continue as general manager of this team because I don't think there's any way to defend the total body of work. You could say he made a good move here, a good move there. You could say he had an excellent draft class in 2022. That's fair. But Joe Douglas needed to go. The problem is, how are we going to get a good replacement in here? That's really difficult to see because the ownership has done everything in its power to scare away good candidates. And even if they could even if there was a good candidate out there willing to work for them, it's not clear the ownership could identify and bring this guy in. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one way at least this job could become more attractive. There's a move that needs to be made by this team this offseason. It was true before the Jets fired Joe Douglas, but it's even more true after the firing of Joe Douglas. In fact, this is a non-negotiable at this point. It's a high-profile player, the highest profile player on the team. He's got to go. I've talked about it already this week, and it's even more urgent. We'll get into that as we continue here on this special Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This special edition of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Z-Biotics. Pre-alcohol drink by Z-Biotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Here's how you use it. Step 1, drink pre-alcohol. For best results, make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night. Step 2, drink responsibly. Pace yourself, hydrate, and get a good night's sleep. And step 3, enjoy tomorrow. Wake up feeling refreshed and ready to take on the day. Go to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On NFL at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL at checkout for 15% off. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Of course, no game for the Jets this weekend. I mean, I hate to make the joke, but I think the bye week would be favor over the Jets at this point if FanDuel took those odds. But FanDuel is the place to get in on the NFL action. So visit FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. This is a bonus episode on this Tuesday because the Jets have made a major decision. They have fired general manager Joe Douglas. And I think that there's a move that needed to happen anyway this offseason. The firing of general manager Joe Douglas has added even more urgency to this move. And the move is the Jets need to move on from Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers cannot be allowed to return to this team as quarterback in 2025. And that was true anyway. And I actually did my regular Tuesday show on this topic today. So you might want to check that one out after you're done listening to this episode. Aaron Rodgers has shown that he's pretty much finished. He doesn't really have a lot left in the tank. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. He's currently 29th in the league in yards per attempt. He's 27th in QBR. He's 23rd in passer rating. If you're watching him, I mean, there's just nothing special about him right now. The Aaron Rodgers of Green Bay, the Aaron Rodgers who won 4 MVPs with the Packers, is gone. He doesn't make any wow plays anymore. He can't move anymore. His arm is clearly in decline, but he has been a dominant force on this team over the last 2 years. And I think that the toughest aspect of selling this job for the Jets, as I mentioned in the first segment, is ownership. Because, yeah, the Jets have a bad cap situation, but you know what? A good general manager can work you out of a bad cap situation. Jets are going to need to work on their talent base. It's not as bad as it was in 2020 or back in 2016 when the Jets were, starting new phases of rebuilds. There is some talent here, but even if you had a bad talent situation, a new GM can come in and bring in talent. In fact, if you're a GM candidate, you understand that you're probably inheriting a pretty bad situation. The great teams don't have GM openings because they're happy with their general managers. Kansas City's GM job is not open. Baltimore's job is not open. Detroit's job is not open. Those teams have good GMs. Those teams aren't going to fire their GMs. The teams that have general manager openings are typically bad teams. That's the reason that they have those openings is that they're bad. So you understand those things. The thing that scares you off is bad ownership because you will have a plan as a candidate. The question is whether the owner will implement the plan or whether the owner will undercut you. And there's probably no greater example of an owner undercutting his front office in recent history than what Woody Johnson has allowed over the last 2 years with the New York Jets, because they did not merely trade for Aaron Rodgers. They essentially handed Aaron Rodgers the keys to the franchise. They ended up essentially sinking a whole free agency period waiting for the Rodgers trade because Woody Johnson decided that the Jets were Rodgers away from the Super Bowl. It was like the Jets believed that Rodgers was worth it at any price, even at his advanced age, even after showing some signs of decline that final year of Green Bay. And Rodgers was not the only one who came here. The Jets did everything possible they could to placate Rodgers. They hired Nathaniel Hackett as their offensive coordinator to disastrous results. They signed Alan Lazard in free agency to disastrous results. I know he's been a little bit better this year, but now he's hurt. They've signed Randall Cobb, who had 5 catches all season. That this year they traded for Davante Adams. Rodgers isn't just a quarterback. Rodgers is essentially the most important guy on the team. That's what the owners made him. In fact, when the reports came out today that the Jets fired their general manager, I somewhat jokingly asked, did they fire Rodgers? Because Rodgers has been the guy controlling the team. And if you're coming in as a new general manager, you need complete control of this team. You need the authority to make the moves that you want to make. Rodgers, if he comes back next year, first of all, it's going to make the cap situation much more complicated. We talked about this on the show earlier today, how the Jets already are going to have to pay $49 million in dead money when he retires. And that's going to happen. There's no way to get rid of that $49 million. When he comes back next year, we add an extra $37.5 million to what the Jets are going to have to pay against the cap. It's for a guy who really hasn't shown that he's got much ability left. But beyond that, if you're bringing back 41-year-old Rodgers, I'm sure you're bringing back Davante Adams at an inconceivable $35.6 million price tag. That's his base salary next year. You're probably bringing Lazard back around $13 million cap hit. And this is just going to make the rebuild process even more difficult. And we know Rodgers is not going to give in because, in Green Bay, he fought them at every step when they didn't do what he wanted. We know Rodgers is not going to buy into a rebuild at 41 years old. He's going to say, this is my final year in the league. We got to go for it. And the Jets will continue down this devastating path that they've been on. Who will be the Tyron Smith they bring in this year? Who will be the Mike Williams they bring in this year? They're going to keep bringing in veteran players. They're going to keep using up future resources. They may even trade more draft picks to bring in veteran players to try and juice this thing up in the short run. And it will just make it that much more difficult to dig out of the hole. It will make it that much more difficult to rebuild. And tangibly, you're putting off the rebuild for another year. If you're a general manager candidate looking at the situation, if Rodgers is allowed to return, first of all, you have no authority because Rodgers has been allowed to run the team. And we know Rodgers is not going to buy into being a veteran mentor because he didn't do it in Green Bay. When the Packers drafted Jordan Love, he's not going to buy into that. I know some people will say, well, they should draft a quarterback, let him sit behind Rodgers for a year. Don't do that. Rodgers has shown he's not going to buy into any scenario where the team drafts his replacement. There are other veteran quarterbacks you can bring in to be the mentor, to be the stopgap guy, to be the bridge quarterback. Rodgers is not going to buy into that. Rodgers has been clear that he wants to keep winning. Unfortunately, he's not capable of delivering wins anymore. And the guys he wants to bring in, they're not that good anymore. I mean, none of the guys the Jets have brought in because of Rodgers' influence have really helped the team all that much. And if you're the general manager, you need authority. You need authority to move on. You need to begin this rebuild now because the longer you wait, the more resources you waste on this Rodgers thing. It's just going to make it that much more difficult to dig out of it. And if Rodgers comes back for one more year, if you delay the rebuild even one more year, the new general manager might be fired by the time the team actually has a chance to be good because you're just delaying the process. You're delaying the inevitable. And the end result is that anybody who's a general manager candidate is going to be smart enough to see all this. These guys, you don't get to be a top general manager candidate by being stupid. They're going to see that they will have no chance to win with this organization. And the Jets already have enough issues. Jets are going to have enough issues filling this job, again, because of ownership. Because this is not a respected ownership in the league. It's an ownership that will have every candidate skeptical that they have what it takes to win. Every candidate will be skeptical that they will be allowed to do the job without meddling from ownership. You don't need to add an extra layer of difficulty to this by adding the Rodgers effect, because we know what the Rodgers effect brings. It brings a bunch of his buddies in here who can't play as well as they used to. A bunch of big names who just don't have it anymore. And that's not conducive to the Jets eventually building a winning team. There are enough obstacles in the way of this franchise already. You don't need to create extra ones. Aaron Rodgers needed to go anyway, because Aaron Rodgers at 40 is just not an effective quarterback anymore. That's becoming increasingly clear through the season. His body cannot hold up. He's a shell of the player he used to be. So tangibly speaking, this is a football move that needed to happen anyway. But now if you're trying to fill a general manager job, you can't have this guy around. It just doesn't work. So the Jets absolutely need to make it needed to happen anyway. I don't think it changes the fact that this had to happen, but it makes it more urgent because now you're risking essentially your ability to whatever extent it exists, to hire a new general manager who's a quality guy if Aaron Rodgers returns. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to Joe Douglas. There were a lot of mistakes Joe Douglas made during his tenure, a lot of moves that did not pan out. But I think there's one mistake that stands out above all else. It's probably not what you're thinking of. I'll tell you what I think the biggest mistake of Joe Douglas's tenure was as we continue here on this special Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This special edition of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Rewards. Listen up, renters. Ever feel like you're stuck in this loop of rent payments, just watching your money vanish into thin air? Well, it's time to turn that rent game around and start earning some serious rewards. That's where Built Rewards comes in. Built is breaking ground as a neighborhood rewards program that hooks you up with points on your rent. Every month, pay your rent and watch the Built points roll in. Use points to jet off on a dream vacation. Put your points toward a flight or hotel stay with over 500 airlines and over 700,000 hotels and properties. You can also use your points to book fitness studio classes, redeem them toward a future rent payment. They're designed to meet your lifestyle. Pay rent hassle-free through the Built Rewards app. Your rent game just got a major upgrade. Built points have been consistently ranked the highest point value currency by the Points Guy and Bankrate. Earn points by paying rent right now when you go to joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL. That's joinbilt.com/LockedOnNFL. Make sure to use our URL so they know we sent you. Joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL to start earning points with your rent payments today. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. It's a special edition as the New York Jets have fired general manager Joe Douglas. And if you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And in the days ahead, we will have plenty more on this decision to fire Joe Douglas, along with some analysis on where the New York Jets may go from here. But I'd like to end the show by talking about what I think the biggest mistake in Joe Douglas's tenure was. And look, when you go 30-64 as a general manager in 5.5 years, there obviously were big mistakes. There were a lot of free agent signings Douglas made that did not pan out. There were also some high-profile draft picks which really failed, most notably Mekhi Becton, left tackle. It was Douglas's first draft pick with the team in 2020. They drafted Becton, top 11, did not pan out, in part because of injury, but also in part because, Becton was just the wrong fit for the team. I think most people would say Douglas's biggest mistake was drafting Zach Wilson, number 2 overall in 2021. And, look, it's very difficult to recover from drafting a quarterback second overall and that quarterback failing to the extent Zach Wilson did. But I think Douglas's biggest mistake is actually different. I think Douglas's biggest failure was a failure to manage up. And in the NFL, especially for general managers, that might be the most important. That's one of the most important traits there is, the ability to handle your owner. And when you look at the way Woody Johnson has taken over the team the last 2 years, when you look at the path of destruction Woody Johnson has left over these last 2 years, in some ways I have to blame Douglas because Douglas didn't stop it. It almost felt like Douglas was along for the ride. It's almost like Douglas viewed everything that happened, the Aaron Rodgers trade, bringing in all of Rodgers' buddies, as a mechanism to save his job. After the 2022 season, the Jets were coming off a difficult finish. They had gone from 7-4 to 7-10. They ended the season on a 6-game losing streak, and Woody Johnson stepped in. And at the time, there were many reports that Woody Johnson was instrumental behind the Jets changing offensive coordinators. It was the classic Woody Johnson ready, fire, aim scenario. Because the Jets fired Mike LaFleur, it didn't seem like they had a good backup plan. It didn't seem like they had a good guy to move on to. And they ended up with Nathaniel Hackett. As we now know, Nathaniel Hackett was part of a master plan to end up landing Aaron Rodgers. And look, there was an argument to be made at the time that trading for Aaron Rodgers made sense, but not in the way the Jets did it. Not in a way where it essentially holds your offseason hostage, because you have to remember, that trade was not completed until a couple days before the draft, until free agency was essentially over. So the Jets were pretty much frozen in free agency. They did not sign many guys. They did not address many needs that offseason in free agency. And a big part of it was the holdup with the Rodgers trade made it unclear how much cap space they had to operate with. And there were players who said that, we weren't sure. I wasn't sure Rodgers was going to be there. So I didn't sign with the Jets. I took the Jets off my list. Douglas, I think at that point, needed to step in with Woody Johnson. And it's tough to do with your boss. It's tough to stand up to your boss. It's tough to tell your boss, we need to do things this way. It's tough to tell your boss, I think that this is the wrong path we're going on. But at the time, Douglas was coming off an incredible draft class. That was the year after the 2022 draft class where the Jets took Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall and Jermaine Johnson. Douglas had just drafted both rookies of the year at that point. Would Woody Johnson have listened? I don't know. But that was at a point where Douglas did have some degree of political capital, even if it wasn't with the Jets, even if Woody Johnson was mad at Douglas because of the 6-game losing streak. What's the worst that happens? If Douglas gets fired at that point, he's probably going to get another GM job in the league, because he could go around in interviews and say, I drafted the offensive rookie of the year and the defensive rookie of the year, and then Woody Johnson overruled me. Then I gave Woody Johnson advice he didn't like after hitting it out of the park with his draft class. And everybody knows what a bad owner Woody Johnson is across the league. Do you think Joe Douglas would have been able to sell that and get a new GM job? I think so. At some point, you have to be worried about the final product your team's putting on the field, even if it means putting your own job in peril. And look, I understand that Woody Johnson is such a bad owner that there might be nobody who can manage up effectively. It just doesn't seem like Douglas tried. It seemed like Douglas just kind of rolled over. And that's been one of the stories of the last 2 years. Douglas did not stand up to Woody Johnson when Woody Johnson drove the Aaron Rodgers trade. And it's one thing to trade for Aaron Rodgers. It's another thing to do it the way the Jets did it, where there was no plan B, where it was like Aaron Rodgers or bust, where the Jets were unwilling to walk away from the table. And when you're unwilling to walk away from the table, you make a bad deal. And not only that, when you're unwilling to walk away from the table, when you make a player such a priority, you give the player a tremendous amount of leverage. And that's part of the reason the Jets ended up signing all of Aaron Rodgers' friends, who ended up not helping the team at all. Douglas needed to have a stronger hand in this. Douglas needed to stand up to Woody Johnson and tell him the path this team is on is wrong. Instead, Douglas, I feel like, just kind of went along to get along. Douglas thought he could save his job by just going along with what the owner wanted. What he didn't count on is that it didn't matter that the owner drove all these decisions. The owner was even if the owner made the decisions, he was ultimately going to hold Douglas accountable for the results, because that's what Woody Johnson does. Woody Johnson never takes responsibility for anything. Woody Johnson finds scapegoats. He finds other people to blame when he messes up. Douglas's actions over the last 2 years, or his inactions, have contributed to this franchise's demise. Or maybe I should say the latest version of this franchise's demise. And I think when he looks back on this, I think he's going to look back on this and wish he had spoken up more. I think he's going to wish that he had stood up to Woody Johnson and prevented the Jets from going on this destructive of a path, because ultimately it's put the team in much worse shape than it needed to be. And it's led to Douglas losing his job. If the Jets had stayed on the path they were on, they were making progress. They had drafted both rookies of the year. They had drafted 4 quality players in 2022. Instead, they decided to go on a very different path. They decided to bet it all on Aaron Rodgers as Rodgers was aging. They decided to bring in all of Aaron Rodgers' friends, and the results have been disastrous. And now the Jets find themselves in a very difficult spot at the start of what could be yet another attempt to rebuild this roster. Anyway, we'll have plenty more on Joe Douglas in the days ahead, but that's all for this episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.